Hello and welcome back to Microsoft Server Administration 1. My name is Nick. The topic of the video is Active Directory installation. Now, if you recall in a different video, in a previous video, I showed you how to install DNS as a standalone role. Now, in your labs, you will install DNS as part of the Active Directory installation. And the reason I did it a little bit differently is to show you how much Active Directory depends on DNS. I want to start the Active Directory discussion, however, talking about local users and local groups. So if I go to my Server Manager console, I can expand the configuration node and expand from there the local users and local groups node. And I have a couple of containers, one called users and one called groups. If I click on the users container, I see the users that this server currently knows about. One that was automatically created whenever I installed the operating system was administrator. That has control over the whole box as far as the operating system is concerned. And we have a disabled guest account. Now I can add users simply by choosing the new user, a right-click menu, new user, and fill out the information here and press create. I can create as many users as I would like to in this console here. And by the way, this is called the Security Account Manager, or the SAM database. This lives on the local server. Now, no matter how many user accounts I create here, this server is the only machine on the network that knows about those user accounts. Okay, even if I installed another Windows 2008 server and it created its own administrator user account, that new Windows 2008 server would not know about this administrator account. They're two different accounts. And reason I'm bringing that up is because in a small workgroup environment, when you have several computers and they're all standalone installations, we don't have a centralized repository for authentication. We end up with user accounts stored on each individual box, each individual operating system. And so if I wanted to go across the network and access resources on a different computer, that computer is going to challenge me with a prompt asking for a username and a password. And you would have to use a username and password that that computer you're trying to access knows about. So if I wanted to access resources stored on this server, then I would have to enter a username and password that this server knows about. That would be administrator in this case. That's the only user I have configured on this box. Or I could create a new user as the administrator on this box. I could create Fred here and give him a last name of Smith and password 1. We're going to repeat that. Now I can create him, and so if I'm trying to access resources stored on this machine, then I would have to type in either the administrator account living on this local computer or the Fred Smith account living on this local computer. Regardless of whether those accounts were stored on other computers in the network, I would still have to punch in the password that this computer knows about. One of those reasons, even if the same names of users were set up on other computers in the network, the Windows operating system does not reference user accounts by the names that we see. We see the word administrator or Fred Smith. What Windows sees is what's called a security identifier, or a SID. And I'll show you what one of those looks like here. I'm going to show you in the registry, regedit, and I'm just going to drill down and let you see what a SID looks like. And I'm not going to show you the place where user accounts are stored, I'm actually going to show you where the place where the profiles are stored on the box. The user account profiles, when you log into a machine, it creates the folder structure, desktop, documents, pictures. That's a profile. And I'm going to show you where those are stored. And in this location in the registry called Profile List, we actually have a listing of SIDs here. So S1518, S1519, and 20. These are all system profile, local service, network service. These are system level accounts that every Windows server has. This right here is an actual user account. You see the number here is much longer. That number is called a SID, S1521, and on with random numbers there. That is called a SID, a security identifier. That's what Windows is referencing whenever you call a user account. It's not referencing the administrator name, it's referencing that SID. And SIDs on every Windows user account and every Windows computer for that matter are different. So you have to know which user account you want to call. Okay? And Windows is going to call that SID that corresponds to that user account. So that's the users container, local users, only this box knows about them. The same thing with the groups, and there are several built-in groups here, free for the price of admission. And once again, we can create groups all we want to here. Test group, okay, and give it a description, or and I can even add members here. I can add members from this local box, and give it, say, Fred is in this thing here. So demo server 1/Fred, there he is, and now I have a group. So same thing, these groups here, only this server knows about them, right? So the user accounts and groups living on local boxes, and only those computers knowing about them, that works for smaller networks and work groups and things like that. But when we start to get to a larger network, say 50, 60 computers, even 100 on up, things start to get a little bit messy when we have these local user accounts stored all over the place and we're trying to keep up with all this stuff. Things get messy really quickly. So what we need is a centralized way to keep up with user accounts, passwords, and other security settings. That's where Active Directory comes in. So Active Directory is simply a server role that we install on the Windows operating system, on Windows Server operating system. So if we go to our roles here and add roles, we can choose Active Directory roles here. The role that installs Active Directory, the authentication piece, and making the actual domain of Active Directory, the forest and things like that, that's called Active Directory Domain Services. Now, Windows 2008 wants you to install this role first, and then run what we call dcpromo to actually create the Active Directory domain. Okay? What the domain services role really does is simply install a couple of binaries in the background, the .NET framework and things like that, that make it possible for us to run dcpromo and install our domain. However, I typically don't do this because I think it's a waste of time. Because the dcpromo checks for this stuff and installs it if it's not there. I'm going to cancel all this stuff, and I am simply going to go to Start menu, type in dcpromo, and press enter. And this is going to check for those binaries, for that .NET framework and the Active Directory Domain Services role. And if it's not there, it's going to install it for me. Okay? So in my opinion, for our purposes, there is really no need to take a two-step approach here. Simply just type in dcpromo, let it do the check for the role, and install the role if it's not there. Now I can see the value of installing the a domain services role to pre-stage or pre-configure a computer before you want to install the domain. I can see the value in that. Or be able to have the consoles there to connect to an existing domain controller, but to actually promote the domain controller to promote the server to a domain controller, I really don't see a necessity to take a two-step approach to create your domain. So we're going to let this finish and carry on when it gives us the wizard for DC Promo. Okay, the binaries have been installed, and now it spit us out into the actual DC Promo wizard where we can create our domain. So we're going to click next on the intro screen here. This is a warning about older Microsoft operating systems and how they really don't play well with the newer servers when it comes to Active Directory. And they're specifically talking about NT 4.0 servers here. So next on that, we do not already have an Active Directory domain to hook into. So we have to create a brand new one. So create a new domain in a new forest. Next on that, and now it wants the domain name. What domain do we want to create here? I am going to choose Acme and the top level domain of .local. Now I know it's a no-no to use .local in any environment, but I'm doing it anyway, so meh. Acme.local. Next on that, it's going to check whether that domain name is already being used anywhere, and I happen to know it's not in our network. Okay, this talks about functional level. There are forest functional levels and domain functional levels. What it amounts to is with every version of Microsoft Windows and applications that come with Microsoft Windows, with every version there are new features. Okay, same thing with Active Directory. With every new version of Active Directory on the associated versions of Windows, there are new features in Active Directory to take advantage of. So the functional levels provide those features associated with the different versions of Windows. Now, for our purposes, we're going to choose 2008 R2 because this is a class on 2008 R2. We don't have older servers to stay compatible with in our network. Say if we had 2,000 machines that were domain controllers, this only applies to domain controllers, servers running Active Directory. So if we had Windows 2000 domain controllers in our network, we would have to remain on this Windows 2000 functional level to be compatible with those domain controllers. But since we don't have any older servers in our network, any older domain controllers in our network actually, we're going to use the 2008 R2 Forest functional level. And you can read some of the features it gives there. Next on that, and this is going to check for DNS configuration. Remember, Active Directory relies heavily on DNS. Matter of fact, the acme.local we typed in previously, that will be our Active Directory domain, and that will also install a DNS zone. That will also be the name of our DNS zone. Active Directory uses the namespace provided by DNS. Okay. This box on your labs will be unchecked. You will not have already installed DNS. I did install DNS, so this box has already been grayed out. The role is already there. Now, what's going to happen here is the wizard is going to check for a zone in DNS. It's going to try to contact, it's going to reach out to our network and look for a DNS zone called acme.local. If it's not there, it will create it. If it is there, it'll hook into it. Well, we currently do not have a DNS zone in our network for acme.local. So it's going to create it. And that is what this box is telling us. No DNS zone for acme.local. I'm going to go ahead and create it in DNS. So do you want to continue? Yes. These are the default locations for the Active Directory database logs and sysvol folders. These locations are perfectly fine in our lab environment. In a production environment, you may want to consider disk space and disk speed for these locations here. Next on that, this is the Active Directory Restore Mode Administrator password. In a production environment, you want to be extremely careful about what you type here and make sure you save this password, keep it protected, and keep it secure. This is in the event you have to restore Active Directory. Say your Active Directory becomes corrupt and you have to restore it. You will have to boot into what's called Directory Services Restore Mode. And in order to do a restore of Active Directory in that mode, you have to use the Restore Mode password, which is what you're going to set right here. If you lose this password, you cannot retrieve it. You cannot reset it, because once you need it, you can't get to it to reset it. So not having this password can create what we call a career-defining moment. In other words, you've lost your job and quite possibly not going to be working anywhere else in the IT field. The moment that you lose someone's Active Directory domain, that pretty much marks the end of it. Okay, Active Directory is so critical in an environment that if you screw it up, you're pretty much toast. Okay, career-defining moment. Take this password, write it down, seal it in an envelope, seal that envelope in another envelope, stick it in a safe, and lock it up and don't touch it. When you need it, it's there. Okay. I set password 1 here. So next on that, don't let me catch you setting password 1 for your restore mode password, by the way. Use a secure password. Use some common sense, okay? This is the summary here. Press next on that. And this is going to do our installation, set up our domain, set up our DNS zone, and we'll be back when this process finishes. Okay, process is finished, and we are simply just going to press the finish button, and it's going to prompt us for a reboot. We're going to take it. Okay, the server has rebooted, and now we get the login prompt. And the first thing we notice here is our logon prompt is a little bit different. Now, instead of just saying administrator here, we have acme/administrator. That acme should look a little bit familiar. That is the Active Directory domain we just installed. Now, what you may be thinking is, wait a minute, we installed acme.local. Why don't we see acme.local there in front of that slash? That is because what we're using here is the NetBIOS domain name. The NetBIOS domain name, a little bit different. It is up to a 15-character name used by older clients. We still use it in what we call down-level logon notation. That's what this is. So this is domain/administrator. Just a little free tidbit here. This logon notation also works to specify a local computer SAM database to log into. Right now, the default here is logging in, bouncing authentication information off of Active Directory database. If on a member server that's joined to our domain, if we wanted to bounce authentication information off of the local SAM database, we would switch user and specify the local computer name, / and whatever the local user account living on that server was. That searches the local SAM database for a user account that you specified. So in this instant, we are going to search the acme.local domain, the acme domain in Active Directory, for the administrator user account, and our password should match up with that, and it will log us in. Now the next thing you may be thinking is, wait a minute, we haven't created any user accounts in Active Directory because we haven't even seen Active Directory yet. What happened here was Active Directory installation was very nice to us. It took the user accounts that were in our local SAM database and brought them over to Active Directory with the same passwords that we already had. So nice and handy. Password 1 is what I set as my administrator account password here. So going to log in and let it create my brand new domain profile on this server. My profile has been created, and I should see, since I'm logged in as an administrator here, there we go, add initial configuration tasks, and I can close that, and I should see my server manager console pop up here in just a second. And there that is. If I expand my roles, now I see both Active Directory and DNS. DNS was installed previously, as I showed you in a video before this one. Now, I mentioned during the DNS video that I installed DNS first to show you how much Active Directory depends on DNS. So I want to show you that now. I'm going to open the DNS console here. And previously, after I installed DNS, we only had a zone for foo.com. Well, after we installed Active Directory installed a zone for acme.local. And we see that in DNS now. Now, if we look in our foo.com zone that I installed, that I set up, we only have a few records in here and just a little bit of information. Now, the first thing we see that Active Directory has done for us is not only created a zone for acme.local, but also a zone for msdcs.acme.local. So we already have some advanced information here in DNS, and if we expand the plus sign besides acme.local, we see all kinds of stuff in here. Okay, this gives you an idea of how much Active Directory makes use of DNS. Not only do we have in our zone here, we have our A record for our server name and its associated IP address. We also have some subtree items here, and if we click on one of them, we can see its contents, and we see things like this: service location records. Active Directory makes enormous use of service location records. Whenever you log into the domain, what you're actually doing, what's actually happening in the background, is a request will go out to DNS, whoever's providing DNS, saying, I need to authenticate to the acme.local domain. Who is providing authentication services? DNS will get that request, and DNS will say, let me see who I have providing authentication services via the Kerberos protocol, and who is providing LDAP, or Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. That is what Active Directory is loosely based on, LDAP. And it uses the Kerberos authentication protocol. So DNS finds these service location records. And the service location records say that demo server 1.acme.local is responsible for handling those services. So it looks in its A record and says, where does demo server 1 live? Lives at 192.168.1.11. So DNS then gives that back to the client and says, you can find authentication services at 192.168.1.11. The client then contacts that server directly and has the authentication conversation there and logs in with domain credentials. That's what's happening in the background when you log into Active Directory. So, or whenever anything happens that has to do with Active Directory, that kind of conversation happens. DNS is looking for service location records and identifying a server handling that particular service that has to do with Active Directory and directing the client to that IP address for the server handling that service. This is the role that DNS plays behind the scenes for Active Directory. That's why Active Directory relies so much on DNS. So much so that I normally say when someone comes to me with an Active Directory problem, the problem typically is not with Active Directory. The problem typically is with DNS. So I'll look for a DNS problem before I'll look for an Active Directory problem. Okay, so let's switch gears here and look at what we've done here to when we installed Active Directory. Start administrative tools. We will start in Active Directory users and computers. There's several different consoles here we can look at. I'm starting with this one. So we open this console and we can see our domain name that we installed, acme.local. If we expand that, we see some tree items under here. These are all called containers. They look like folders. Okay, they are called containers. These items with this regular folder next to them, they are container items. These items with a folder that have a small cylinder contained in them, those are a special kind of container called an organizational unit, or OU. We'll play with those in the next module. The users container holds all the user accounts and some of the groups for our domain. If you'll notice that we have administrator in here, that was contained in our local SAM database, but also Fred was contained in our local SAM database. Now, Active Directory did not pull Fred's last name from our local SAM database, or at least not for the display name. If we double click him, we can see his last name here, Smith, but really no real information carried over from our local SAM database. But it did pull our administrator user account over, and he has a lot of rights here, which we will see later on. And it also pulled our test group over from the SAM database. That was very nice of Active Directory to do that for us. And all the rest of this stuff is built in. Domain admins, domain computers, domain controllers. Anything you see with two heads on it is a group. Anything you see with one head on it is a user. Okay? So several things here free for the price of admission with Active Directory. Each thing has a different purpose. Each group has a different purpose. And the administrator user account, the SAM database version was kind of merged with the administrator contained in Active Directory. Kind of merged it in there, gave us the same password, that kind of thing. Now, the built-in container holds the built-in groups that Active Directory has given us. The computers container will hold any domain member computer. So if we joined a Windows 7 computer, joined a Windows Vista computer to our domain, they would appear in here. We will see that later on in the semester. Our domain controllers container, also an OU, contains all of our Active Directory servers or domain controllers. We see our server called Demo Server 1 in this container. Foreign security principals, anyone authenticating to our domain from other domains would appear in here, and managed service accounts. We might cover what that is later on, but we won't mess with them much. That's a new feature in Server 2008 R2. So we have installed Active Directory. That is, you can see it's not very hard to install Active Directory, but understanding it is a little bit more involved. But once you get a grasp on it, it is really a simple concept to understand. Now, Active Directory does get very complicated, but don't let that scare you. We're going to break it down, and we're going to learn to have some fun with it on our own. So if you have any questions on the installation of Active Directory or how it relates to DNS in a general sense, just write those questions down. Bring them to class. We'll talk about them in class, or simply email me. We can discuss them there too. I will see you in class, and thank you for watching.